For years, Detectives Briggs and Calloway abused their badges, raiding homes under false pretenses, stealing from the people they swore to protect, brutalizing those who dared to question them. Then, one day, they stormed into the home of Darius Carter, a former Delta Force commander, after receiving a so-called tip about suspicious activity. He was unarmed, guilty of nothing, but that didn't matter. When Darius asserted his rights, they responded with force. Then, when he refused to stay down, they drew their weapons. But this time, they weren't dealing with a man who would break. Bloodied and cornered, Darius fought back, and when he escaped, they fired. They thought they could frame him, silence him, before the truth came out. They thought the department would bury the evidence, just as it always had. But this time, they picked the wrong man. Justice is coming, and it will be ruthless. Before we go any further, comment where in the world you are watching from, and make sure to subscribe. The air inside the house carried the warmth of familiarity now. No longer the sterile emptiness it had when Darius Carter first stepped through the door. In the days since his return, he had settled into a rhythm, the kind of routine that felt almost foreign after years of structured discipline, early wake-ups, and mission briefings. He had unpacked, organized, made the space his own. His belongings were few, but the walls no longer felt bare. The rooms no longer hollow. The house, once just a property he had purchased from a distance, was starting to feel like home. The neighborhood had welcomed him back in full force. Friends had stopped by, family had checked in, and old comrades had made their appearances, some staying for long conversations, others dropping in for a few minutes before heading off. His aunt, Patricia, had come by with an entire week's worth of meals, claiming he wouldn't be eating military food under her watch. It had been a steady flow of faces, some expected, others showing up at random times throughout the day. At first, he had embraced it. He hadn't realized how much he had missed this. Normalcy, laughter, conversations that didn't revolve around tactical maneuvers or deployment schedules. But by the third or fourth day, he had started noticing the pattern. People coming and going, all well-meaning, all harmless. But to someone watching from the outside, it might look like something else entirely, and someone had been watching. Darius had seen the unmarked cars lingering at the end of the block, the slow drive-bys that weren't just casual passers-by. At first, he had brushed it off as coincidence, but by the third time, it was clear. They were watching his house, and now, they weren't just watching. There was a sharp knock at the door. Heavy, deliberate. The kind of knock that wasn't just announcing a presence, but demanding to be acknowledged. Darius exhaled slowly, setting down the glass of water he had been holding. He wasn't expecting company, and from the tone of that knock, whoever was on the other side wasn't here for a friendly visit. He made his way to the door, unlocking it, but not opening it fully, keeping a firm grip on the handle as he glanced outside. 2 officers stood on his porch, both white, both exuding the kind of presence that didn't need to be spoken aloud to be understood. They weren't here to ask questions. They had already made up their minds. One of them, the taller of the 2, shifted his stance slightly, arms loose at his sides in a way that suggested he was comfortable in his authority, in his control over the situation. His badge read, Briggs. The second, slightly shorter but stockier, had a permanent scowl set into his face, his eyes scanning Darius as if already searching for something incriminating. His badge read, Calloway. Evening, Briggs said, though there was nothing polite about it. You mind stepping outside for a minute? Darius didn't move. He kept his expression calm, neutral, but his instincts were already firing. This wasn't a social visit. This was a setup. I'm fine right here, Darius replied evenly. Briggs let out a breath, his eyes flicking past Darius and into the house, taking stock of whatever he could see from where he stood. We got a call, Calloway said, stepping slightly forward, his tone sharper, more direct. Neighbor reported a lot of people coming in and out of this house. Said it looked suspicious. Darius didn't so much as blink. Suspicious. He had heard that word used far too many times to know exactly what it meant in a situation like this. You know, welcoming back friends and family isn't usually considered a crime, Darius said, his voice measured, careful. Unless that's changed. Briggs smirked slightly, but there was no humor behind it. See? That's the thing, though. When folks start coming and going at all hours, sometimes it makes people nervous. And when people get nervous, we have to check things out. There it was. The justification, the pretense, the excuse wrapped in thinly veiled authority. They weren't here to check things out. They were here because they had already decided what they wanted to believe. Darius exhaled through his nose, his grip on the door tightening. Well, you checked. Now you see everything's fine. Briggs and Calloway exchanged glances, the kind of silent communication that spoke volumes. Calloway took another step forward. You mind if we come in? Darius didn't hesitate. Actually, yeah, I do. Briggs clicked his tongue, shaking his head as if Darius had just made the wrong choice. Come on now. Don't make this difficult, he said. Darius met his gaze, unflinching. I know my rights. You don't have a warrant. You're not coming in. Silence stretched between them, heavy, electric. Briggs and Calloway weren't used to being told no. Calloway's jaw tightened, his fingers twitching at his side. You got something to hide? Darius didn't react. He had seen this tactic before. The push, the provocation, the attempt to get him to react, to give them an excuse to escalate. I think we're done here, Darius said, beginning to push the door closed. But before he could shut it, Calloway shoved forward, slamming his shoulder against the door, forcing it open. Darius took a step back, his heart hammering, but he kept his hands open, kept himself in control. They were violating the law, and they knew it. But they also knew they could get away with it. Briggs stepped inside first, slow, deliberate, scanning the room like he had just been granted entry to a crime scene. Calloway followed, his hand drifting too close to his holster for it to be anything but a threat. Darius took a deep breath, steadying himself, keeping his stance strong. He had fought in war zones, had been surrounded by enemies, had faced down threats far greater than these two men. But this was different. This was home, and now it wasn't safe. Darius forced himself to breathe evenly, to keep his pulse steady, his expression unreadable as the two officers pushed their way into his home without a warrant, without permission, without hesitation. He had seen men like them before, overseas and stateside, men who carried power like a weapon, men who didn't see laws as rules, but as obstacles, things to sidestep when they felt like it, things to enforce only when it served them. Briggs walked in first, moving with the slow, deliberate confidence of someone who had done this before and never faced consequences for it. His gaze swept over the living room, taking in the neatly stacked boxes, the organized shelves, the folded blankets on the couch. Calloway was more obvious in his disdain, his eyes narrowing as if he were looking for something to justify the suspicion they had walked in with. Darius didn't move from where he stood, his feet planted firmly on the hardwood floor, his body still as he tracked their movements. He had spent years training his mind and body for combat situations, for hostile environments, for unpredictable enemies. This was different, but the same tension coiled in his muscles, the same readiness, the same awareness that one wrong move could change everything. You got a nice place, Briggs murmured, trailing a hand along the back of the couch as he walked past it, his fingers barely skimming the fabric. Real clean, real put together. Darius didn't respond. He wasn't going to entertain the performance, wasn't going to pretend this was anything but what it was, a power play, a show of dominance. Calloway wasn't as subtle. He stopped near the kitchen doorway, glancing back at Darius with an almost amused expression. Gotta say, Carter, lot of traffic coming through here for a guy who just got back from deployment. Looks like a real popular spot. Darius's jaw tightened, but his voice remained level. I told you. Friends, family, people welcoming me home. That's all. Briggs made a soft, thoughtful sound, as if he didn't quite believe it, as if the words alone weren't enough to satisfy him. Yeah, see? That's the part I keep circling back to. He turned, folding his arms across his chest, his head tilting slightly as he studied Darius the way a predator studies prey. A man like you, fresh back from overseas, suddenly setting up shop with all these people coming in and out. Now, I don't know about you, but that usually means one of two things. Either you're throwing the biggest damn welcome home party this town's ever seen, or you're selling something. Darius's grip tightened at his sides, his fingers curling into his palms before he forced them to relax. The accusation wasn't direct, but it didn't need to be. It was the kind of veiled statement designed to paint him as something he wasn't, the kind of implication that could turn suspicion into justification, that could turn an illegal entry into a full-blown raid. I'm not selling anything, Darius said, his voice quiet but sharp. I'm not doing anything illegal. You two know that. Calloway scoffed under his breath, shaking his head as he turned toward the hallway, his boots heavy against the floor as he took a few steps toward the back of the house. Then you won't mind if we take a look around, he said. Darius took a step forward, his stance still careful, controlled. But there was no mistaking the edge in his voice. Yeah, actually, I do mind. You don't have a warrant. Briggs sighed like he was dealing with a child, shaking his head as he adjusted the belt at his waist. We're just checking things out, Carter, making sure everything's good. Wouldn't want to get a call later saying we missed something. Darius took another step, his voice steady but firm. No, see, that's not how it works. You don't get to check things out just because you feel like it. You don't get to walk into my home and start searching just because somebody decided a black man having visitors was a problem. Briggs's smile didn't fade, but there was a flicker of something colder in his eyes now. Why you getting so defensive? If there's nothing to find, what's the issue? Darius exhaled sharply, his patience thinning, his restraint holding by a thread. Because I know how this goes. You don't come in to look, you come in to find. Doesn't matter if there's nothing here. You'll tear through my things, you'll mess up my house, and when you don't find anything, you'll just move on to the next guy. Meanwhile, I'm left cleaning up after your check. Calloway, already halfway down the hallway, ignored the conversation entirely. He stepped into Darius's bedroom, boots heavy against the floor. Darius moved to follow him, but Briggs stepped in front of him, blocking his path. I wouldn't do that, Briggs said, voice low, a warning laced beneath the words. Darius stiffened, every instinct in his body telling him to break that grip, to shove the man back, to do something to stop this, but he held himself still, forcing his muscles to stay locked, forcing himself to keep breathing. Then, from down the hall, he heard it, the unmistakable sound of drawers opening, things being shoved aside, belongings being dumped out like garbage. His bedroom, his breathing deepened, his jaw clenching as he struggled to hold back the fury rising in his chest. You don't have a warrant, he said again, forcing the words through gritted teeth. Briggs shrugged. Like I said, just making sure we didn't miss anything. Then he heard something else, a metallic rattle, a faint clinking sound. His heart slammed against his ribs as he looked past Briggs, into the hallway, just in time to see Calloway standing by his dresser, something small and gold glinting between his fingers. Darius knew exactly what it was, his war medal, the one he had earned overseas, the one that had been locked away in a small velvet case in his nightstand. And now, Calloway was turning it over in his fingers like a trinket, like something cheap, something that didn't mean anything. Darius's entire body tensed. He felt the fire, the boiling heat of rage flooding his veins, felt the sharp edge of betrayal carve into his chest like a blade. Then Calloway smirked, and just like that, he pocketed the medal, slipping it into his uniform like it belonged to him. Darius took a step forward, rage flashing behind his eyes. The hell do you think you're doing? His voice was low, sharp, cutting through the space between them like a blade. Calloway didn't even bother looking at him. He just continued rifling through the dresser like he hadn't just stolen something from the man standing in front of him. Briggs placed a heavy hand on Darius's chest, holding him back. Step back. Darius's breath came slower, deeper, his fists curling so tightly that his knuckles ached. He had spent years fighting for a country that saw him as expendable, years putting his life on the line for people who wouldn't think twice about violating his rights in his own home. And now, here he was, watching them steal from him, watching them destroy what little peace he had left. And Calloway, pocketing something that wasn't his, something that meant more than he could ever understand, was standing there like it didn't matter, like Darius didn't matter. Darius felt his heartbeat slow, not in fear, not in hesitation, but in that cold, calculated way his body had been trained to react in high-stress situations. His breaths were deep, steady, his body tensing as he locked his eyes on Calloway's hand, his medal disappearing into the cop's pocket like it was nothing. Something inside him roared. "That's mine," he said, voice sharp, the edge unmistakable, his control hanging by a thread as he stepped forward, pointing directly at Calloway's chest. "You put that back, right now." Calloway barely glanced at him, just smirked, shifting his stance, keeping his hand close to the pocket where he had stashed the medal. "What? This?" He patted his pocket casually, tilting his head, feigning confusion. "Looks like a nice little keepsake. You sure it's yours?" Darius's fists clenched so tightly his nails dug into his palms. "You know damn well it is. Put it back and get the hell out of my house." Briggs let out a low, condescending chuckle, stepping between them before Darius could get any closer, his expression shifting, amusement flickering beneath his hardened gaze. "Now, hold on there, Carter," he said smoothly, his voice carrying that artificial patience that only made the rage burn hotter in Darius's chest. "You're getting awful worked up for a little souvenir." Darius's eyes snapped to him. Souvenir, that's what they thought it was. A trinket, a meaningless object, a thing they could take just because they felt like it. They hadn't earned it. They hadn't bled for it. They hadn't sacrificed for it. They had no right. "Put it back," Darius growled, voice deep, steady, controlled only by sheer will. Calloway exhaled a short laugh, mocking, dismissive. "Or what?" Darius moved. He barely made it a step before Briggs surged forward, slamming a heavy hand against his chest, shoving him back. "All right, that's enough," Briggs said, his tone dropping into something harsher, more commanding. "We've been real patient, but you're getting real aggressive now, Carter." Darius shoved his hand away, stepping forward again, his presence sharp, unyielding, the weight of his fury radiating off him. "I don't give a damn what you think. You're in my house, touching my things, stealing from me. And I'm supposed to sit back and take it. You want to talk about aggressive? You broke into my home, and now you're robbing me. You're the criminals here." Briggs's jaw flexed, the fake patience vanishing in an instant. His eyes flicked to Calloway. That was the signal. Before Darius could react, Calloway moved fast, reaching for his belt, the flash of the taser visible in the dim light of the room. Darius's instincts screamed. He barely had a second to brace before the twin prongs shot forward, striking him in the side of his ribs. The pain hit immediately, a searing jolt that ran through every nerve in his body, locking up his muscles for a split second. His breath caught, his back stiffening, his body threatening to crumple under the raw voltage coursing through his system. But he fought through it, through gritted teeth, through the fire in his veins, through the white-hot agony spreading across his chest. He had been trained for this. He had endured worse. His body had been pushed to its limits before. This would not break him. He took a breath, forced his muscles to move, his body overriding the current, pushing against the electric hold. And then he ripped the prongs out. Briggs barely had time to react before Darius lunged. He slammed into Briggs like a wrecking force, his shoulder driving straight into the officer's sternum, sending him staggering back. Calloway barely had time to register what was happening before Darius turned, a hard elbow driving into his jaw, snapping his head to the side. The fight erupted. Briggs recovered quickly, grabbing for his baton, swinging it toward Darius's ribs. Darius blocked the hit with his forearm, the impact rattling through his bones, but not slowing him. He moved fast, grabbing the baton mid-swing, twisting it out of Briggs's grip with practiced efficiency. Calloway, still reeling from the elbow to the jaw, lunged, trying to tackle him. Darius anticipated it, sidestepped at the last second, driving a knee into Calloway's gut before slamming him against the dresser. The cop grunted, gasping as the air was forced from his lungs. Briggs went for his gun. Darius saw the movement, the slight shift of his arm, the way his fingers instinctively went toward the holster. His training took over. Before the weapon could be drawn, Darius was on him, grabbing his wrist, twisting it with brutal precision, forcing the gun to stay holstered. He pivoted, using the momentum to slam Briggs against the wall, pinning him there with one arm as he delivered a crushing punch to his gut. Briggs coughed, doubling over. Calloway, still wheezing but recovering, reached for the taser again. Darius didn't let him. He spun, grabbing Calloway's wrist, yanking him forward before driving his forehead directly into the officer's nose. The sickening crack of cartilage snapping filled the air, blood spraying as Calloway stumbled back, hands flying to his face. Briggs, gasping, pushed off the wall, desperation in his eyes now. This wasn't going how they thought it would. They had walked in believing they had the power. Now they were fighting for control. Darius wasn't going to give it back. Briggs lunged, swinging wild, but Darius was faster, smoother, his movements efficient, practiced, deadly. He caught the punch, twisted Briggs's arm behind his back, and with one forceful movement drove him forward, sending him crashing into the nightstand. Briggs groaned, struggling to get up, but Darius wasn't done. Calloway was trying to reach for his radio, one hand still pressed against his bleeding nose, the other fumbling for backup. Darius moved before he could. He grabbed Calloway by the collar, spun him around, and hurled him into Briggs, sending both cops toppling over each other. They hit the floor hard, a tangled mess of limbs and pained groans. Darius stood over them, breathing heavy, his chest rising and falling as the fury still burned through his veins. His hand shot to Calloway's pocket. The cop barely had time to react before Darius yanked his war medal free, gripping it tightly in his palm. He looked down at them, his face a mask of unyielding rage. His home was torn apart. His things were broken, scattered. They had violated every inch of his space, crossed every line, and now they were lying on his floor, beaten, humiliated, scrambling to recover. They weren't done yet. Briggs's hand darted toward his belt, reaching for the radio, for the gun, for anything. Darius didn't wait to see what. He turned, bolted for the door. The moment he was in the hallway, he heard Briggs yell, voice hoarse, filled with raw hatred. "Get him!" Darius hit the ground running, his body moving on pure instinct, legs propelling him forward with the kind of speed that had been drilled into him over years of combat training. The walls of his house blurred past him, the broken remnants of his belongings forgotten in the urgency of escape. His pulse pounded in his ears, a steady, powerful drumbeat, keeping time with the heavy thud of his boots against the hardwood floor. He surged toward the door, shoulders low, every fiber of his being wired for survival. Behind him, he heard the frantic scuffling of the two officers scrambling to their feet, the guttural sound of Briggs cursing under his breath, the static crackle of a radio being fumbled with. Then, the gunshot, the sharp, deafening explosion of sound ripped through the air, the bullet tearing through the space where he had been only a second ago, splintering the door frame as he threw himself forward. Another shot, this one closer. Darius barely had time to process it before a searing pain ripped across his left arm. A sudden, fiery sensation that sent a jolt of white-hot agony slicing through his nerves. His body registered the impact before his mind did, his step faltering only slightly as his shoulder wrenched forward from the force of the grazing bullet. Blood bloomed along the sleeve of his shirt, soaking into the fabric, warm, slick. But he didn't stop. He couldn't stop. The night air hit him like a wall, cool but thick with tension, the world outside oblivious to the chaos erupting behind him. He tore down the porch steps, hitting the pavement at full speed, his boots slamming against the asphalt as he pushed through the pain, his breath sharp, controlled, every inhale calculated to keep his body moving. Behind him, Briggs and Calloway stormed out of the house, their shouts cutting through the street like sirens, their gun barrels flashing in the dim glow of the streetlights. "Stop! Get down!" Darius didn't stop, didn't even hesitate. The moment he slowed, the moment he gave them an opening, he was dead. He darted across the street, weaving between parked cars, his mind running calculations as quickly as his feet carried him, scanning for the best route, the best cover, the best way to disappear before they could call in backup and flood the neighborhood with more of them. A barking dog startled him as he sprinted past a chain-link fence, its growls deep and menacing, snapping at the air as he vaulted over the barrier without breaking stride. His wounded arm screamed in protest, but he gritted his teeth, forced himself to ignore the pain. Pain was secondary. Pain didn't matter. Not when he was being hunted. Another gunshot rang out. The pavement near his foot exploded, concrete shattering on impact. They were still firing, still trying to kill him. The realization settled in fully now. Not an arrest, not a takedown. They weren't trying to bring him in. They were trying to put him down. His lips pressed into a grim line, anger and adrenaline fusing into something colder, sharper. They had already broken into his home, brutalized him, stolen from him. That wasn't enough for them. Now, they wanted him dead. Another bullet tore through the air, whizzing past his head, close enough that he could feel the heat of its path before it embedded itself into the side of a rusted-out sedan parked near the curb. Darius veered right, cutting through a narrow alley, the tight walls of brick buildings closing in on him as his boots pounded against the damp asphalt. The city smelled different here, like oil and stale beer. Dumpsters lining the walls in uneven rows. Shadows swallowed him as he pushed deeper into the darkness, the distant hum of traffic growing louder the further he ran. He glanced back once, just once, long enough to see Briggs and Calloway skid to a stop at the alley's entrance, their silhouettes framed against the dim glow of the streetlights. Their guns were up, scanning, searching, but they weren't reckless enough to charge in blindly. They lost him, for now. Darius didn't slow, didn't allow himself the luxury of stopping, of catching his breath. He had minutes, maybe less, before they called for backup, before the streets were crawling with cops, before every squad car in the area had his name and face plastered across their radios. He needed a plan, needed to disappear, needed to find someone who could help him clear his name, before the entire force came bearing down on him. Darius kept moving, his breath coming in deep, controlled gulps as he cut through another alley, staying in the shadows, using the cover of the dimly lit streets to put as much distance between himself and the cops as possible. His arm throbbed, the heat of the bullet graze still searing against his skin. But pain was secondary, a distant warning signal he had no time to process. Blood had soaked through his sleeve, warm and sticky, but he wasn't slowing down. Not until he was sure he was out of their immediate reach. His mind ran through possible escape routes, places to hide, people to trust. Briggs and Calloway wouldn't stop with just him. They would spread their version of the story, poison the airwaves with whatever lie they needed to justify their actions. They would turn him from a man defending his home into a violent fugitive who had attacked police officers. The system always worked faster when it was crushing someone like him. He needed to act before they locked the city down. The main road loomed ahead, neon signs flickering, streetlights buzzing, headlights flashing across intersections. He slowed his pace just enough to blend in, slipping into the flow of pedestrians, forcing his breathing to steady. A man covered in blood moving too quickly would draw attention, and right now, he couldn't afford any. A convenience store stood at the corner, its glass doors sliding open as people moved in and out. Darius ducked inside, his presence barely registering as he grabbed a cheap hoodie from a display near the entrance, paying in cash before slipping it over his head, pulling the hood low. Then he stepped out and made his way toward the only place he knew he could go. Seitito Ting. 15 minutes later, he was standing in front of David Evans's garage. The shop was closed for the night, its metal shutters pulled halfway down, the glow from the single overhead light casting long shadows against the cracked pavement. Darius knocked once, sharp and deliberate, then twice more. A long pause, then the sound of metal scraping against concrete, followed by the creak of the door lifting just enough for a familiar face to peer through. David's expression shifted instantly, from confusion to shock, to immediate, silent understanding. "Get inside," David said, yanking the door open wider. Darius ducked under the metal frame and stepped into the dimly lit shop, the scent of motor oil and steel filling his lungs, a scent so familiar it almost grounded him. The second the door shut behind them, David turned, his gaze locking onto the blood-stained sleeve. "Jesus Christ, man," he muttered, grabbing Darius by the arm, his grip firm but careful. "Tell me that ain't as bad as it looks." "It's a graze," Darius said, pulling the hoodie aside just enough to show the wound. "Missed anything vital." "Just burns," David exhaled sharply, running a hand over his head, muttering under his breath before motioning toward the back of the garage. "Come on, sit down before you fall down." Darius shook his head. "No time. They're coming. They'll be looking for me." David's eyes darkened, the weight of those words settling fast. There was no hesitation, no disbelief, just raw, simmering anger. "What the hell happened?" Darius sat on the worn-out stool in the corner, flexing his injured arm slightly, testing the muscles beneath the torn skin. "Briggs and Calloway broke into my house," he said, voice low, controlled, but filled with the kind of rage that couldn't be hidden. "No warrant, no reason. Started tearing through my stuff, stealing whatever they wanted. One of them took my war medal," his jaw clenched. "When I told them to give it back, they tasered me, tried to take me down. I fought them off and ran. They opened fire as I was leaving." David's nostrils flared. He was already pissed before, but now he looked like he wanted to put his fist through the nearest wall. "They shot at you? In your own goddamn house?" Darius nodded. "Out in the streets, too." David let out a slow breath, shaking his head, pacing slightly, his hands on his hips. "This town, man. Same old damn story." Darius leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, staring down at the cracked floor. "They'll be putting out a bulletin soon, if they haven't already, making me out to be the bad guy. I need to disappear before this whole city's looking for me." David ran a hand over his face, muttering another string of curses under his breath before nodding. "I know a few people who can help. We can get you out of here, at least for the night, but you gotta be smart about this, D. You know they ain't gonna stop just 'cause you ran." Darius nodded. He knew. He had always known. The news hit fast. Within the hour, the entire neighborhood knew. Word spread quicker than any police bulletin. Darius Carter, former Delta Force, home from deployment, had been attacked in his own house by dirty cops and was now being hunted for fighting back. Some were furious, outraged. Others were afraid. And the ones who had been waiting for something like this to happen, the ones who had seen it play out before, knew exactly what came next. The older folks whispered warnings, advising their families to stay inside, to keep their heads down. "They'll make an example of him," they said. "They always do." Back at the garage, David had a burner phone pressed to his ear, pacing back and forth as he spoke in low, urgent tones. Darius sat on the edge of a workbench, wrapping a fresh bandage around his arm, his thoughts racing. "You gotta find Hayes," David said as soon as he hung up, turning to Darius with that same intense focus. "You know he's been trying to take those rats down for years. If anybody can help clear this up before they bury you in charges, it's him." Darius exhaled through his nose, considering. Detective Marcus Hayes, one of the only cops left in the department who wasn't rotten to the core. He'd had his eye on Briggs and Calloway for a while now, trying to dig up enough to bring them down. But would he stick his neck out for Darius now? David must have read the hesitation on his face because he shook his head. "He owes you, man. You saved his kid's life that night at the gas station. He won't forget that. You reach out to him. See if he's got anything on these lowlives that can turn this thing around." Darius nodded once. It was a risk, but it was his best shot, because right now it was only a matter of time before they found him. And if they did, there wouldn't be a second chance. Darius sat in the dimly lit garage, the weight of the situation settling in his chest like a slow-building fire, the kind that didn't rage uncontrollably, but burned steady and deep, refusing to be ignored. The bandage on his arm was tight, the pain manageable, but the adrenaline was starting to wear off, leaving behind something heavier, the realization that this wasn't just a fight anymore. It was a war. David paced in front of him, phone in hand, rubbing the back of his head as he spoke in low, urgent tones. He had already made half a dozen calls in the last 30 minutes, working every back channel, pulling every thread, reaching out to people who might be able to do something before the police department locked the city down completely. Darius stayed silent, watching, listening, thinking. Every second that passed was another second closer to being boxed in. David finally hung up, exhaling sharply as he turned back to Darius, his expression tight, his shoulders tense. "All right, I got Lawson to listen." Darius looked up at him. Andre Lawson, journalist, activist, the kind of man who didn't just report the news. He tore through lies like a blade through cloth, exposing corruption wherever he found it, no matter who it pissed off. He had been chasing the police department's misconduct for years, but the stories never stuck. Not enough evidence, not enough pressure, not enough people willing to put their necks on the line. Until now. David took a breath, shaking his head slightly. He's already hearing whispers that the department's spinning this, trying to bury it before it gets out. But if we get to him first, if we give him something that ties this to the other break-ins, the other cases, we can flip this before they control the narrative. Darius nodded slowly, considering. It was a risk, but the only thing more dangerous than running was staying silent. "He want to meet?" David nodded. "Yeah, but not here. He's too high profile, too many people keeping tabs on him. He's got a safe house, downtown. If you can get to him, he can push this into the spotlight before they can scrub it clean." Darius exhaled through his nose. Downtown was a risk. Too many eyes, too many cameras, too many chances to get spotted. But they needed Lawson. "Fine," Darius said. "Set it up." David hesitated. "You sure, man? You're still bleeding. You're on every radio in the city right now, and those bastards got friends everywhere. This is a long way from safe." Darius pushed off the workbench, testing the strength in his arm. It hurt, but pain was just information. It told him he was alive. And right now, that was all he needed. "I don't need safe," he said. "I need this to end." David studied him for a moment, then nodded. The place was tucked away in a part of the city that didn't draw attention. Run down, worn at the edges, the kind of place people passed without looking twice. Darius had taken the back roads, kept his hood up, changed vehicles twice. Every step had been calculated, every turn deliberate. The cops were looking for him, but he wasn't making it easy. He knocked once, then twice more. The door cracked open, a cautious eye peering through before the locks clicked, and the heavy metal door swung inward. Andre Lawson stood there, sharp-eyed and unreadable, dressed in dark jeans and a worn leather jacket. The look of a man who never stayed in one place too long. "You made it," Lawson said, stepping back to let him in, closing the door behind him. His voice was steady, but there was something underneath it. An urgency, an understanding of just how dangerous this meeting was. Darius didn't waste time. "They broke into my house. No warrant. No cause. They tore it apart, took what they wanted, tried to put me down when I fought back." He pulled the bandage aside just enough to show the wound before covering it again. "Now, I'm the one on the run." Lawson studied him carefully, taking in every word, every injury, every bit of what had already happened. Then he gestured toward the table, where stacks of files, articles, and case reports were scattered. "They've been doing this for years," Lawson said. "Illegal searches, break-ins, stealing cash, valuables, anything they can pocket. And the ones who fight back?" He tapped a file, sliding it toward Darius. Darius opened it, his jaw tightening as he took in photo after photo of men just like him. Black men, beaten, bloodied, arrested under resisting charges, their homes destroyed under the same vague excuses Briggs and Calloway had used. "You're not the first," Lawson said. "They take, they intimidate, and when that doesn't work, they bury people." Darius's hands curled into fists. He had seen it play out before, heard the stories, but now he was in one. "You got proof?" Darius asked, looking up. Lawson nodded. "Some, but not enough. They've covered their tracks well. Every complaint goes missing. Every body cam mysteriously malfunctions. But if we can put enough pressure on them, if we can force their hand before they spin this the way they want, we can turn this whole thing on them." Darius exhaled slowly, his mind working through the angles. He needed something solid, something undeniable. Then, an idea. "Hayes. I've heard there's a detective," Darius said. "Marcus Hayes. He's been trying to take these guys down for years. If he has something on them, it might be enough to push this into the open." Lawson narrowed his eyes. "You trust him?" Darius held his gaze. "No." A pause. "But I trust that he hates them more than he cares about his job." Lawson leaned back slightly, rubbing his jaw. "Then that's our next move." Darius nodded, his hands pressing against the table, his pulse steadying. They weren't out of the fire yet, not even close. But now they had a direction. He was done running. Now he was fighting back. The room was dim, the only light coming from the old brass lamp in the corner, its glow casting long shadows across the stacks of files and reports scattered across the table. Darius stood with his hands braced against the surface, his mind already running through the next move, every possible outcome, every risk. Across from him, Lawson sat, tapping his fingers against a half-empty coffee cup, his eyes flickering between the names in his notes and the burn phone sitting between them. They both knew this call was a gamble. Detective Marcus Hayes wasn't just any cop. He was one of the few still trying to do the right thing in a department drowning in corruption. But that didn't mean he would stick his neck out now. It didn't mean he would risk his career, his life, his family, not for a man the department had already branded as a violent fugitive. Darius wasn't sure what the man would do, but he knew they had no choice but to try. Lawson let out a slow breath, grabbed the burner phone and slid it across the table. "You got history with him," he said. "You make the call." Darius picked it up, dialing the number he hadn't used in years. Across town, Marcus Hayes was staring at his own phone, his jaw tight, his mind already drowning in the consequences of whatever came next. The radio chatter had been non-stop. The official report was already spreading. Darius Carter, armed and dangerous, assaulted 2 officers in his own home before fleeing the scene. The department was in full lockdown mode, patrol cars sweeping neighborhoods, search teams fanning out, officers whispering among themselves about how this was going to end. Hayes had heard the real version, or at least what his gut told him was the truth. Briggs and Calloway weren't just dirty. They were predators, men who thrived on fear, on the knowledge that they could do whatever they wanted and walk away untouched. Darius wasn't the first man they had come after, But if they got their way, he'd be the first one they erased completely. The phone rang once, twice. Hayes stared at it, feeling the weight of it, the finality that would come with answering. He was already dangerously close to crossing a line just by thinking about it, by hesitating, by considering the possibility that the man on the other end of this call wasn't the one the department had painted him to be. If he answered, there was no going back. A third ring, then silence. A voicemail. Darius's voice came through, low, calm, but carrying something beneath it. Something steady. Something undeniable. Hayes, you know me. You know damn well I didn't start this fight, but I'm sure as hell not gonna let them finish it the way they want. You want the truth? You know where to find me. Click. Hayes stared at the screen, his jaw clenched, his thoughts a storm raging behind his eyes. He had a family to think about, a career, a badge that still meant something to him, even if it had been covered in filth for years. If he stepped in now, if he made the wrong move, he wasn't just risking himself. He was making himself a target. He exhaled sharply, pressing his fingers against his temples. Damn it. Damn it all. Back at the safe house, the burner phone buzzed. Darius grabbed it before the second ring, holding it to his ear. Yeah, there was silence for a long moment. Then, finally, Hayes's voice came through. Rough, cautious, but carrying something else, something final. Meet me. 1 hour. The line went dead. Darius exhaled slowly, rolling his shoulders, the tension settling deeper, sharper, but not with fear, with certainty. This was it. One way or another, the tide was about to turn. The meeting place was chosen with intention, a forgotten stretch of the city where the streetlights buzzed inconsistently, where buildings stood with their windows boarded up, where the roads were cracked from years of neglect. No cameras, no curious pedestrians, no witnesses if things went sideways. Darius stood near the alley's mouth, hood up, face shadowed, eyes sharp and scanning every angle. It was instinct, muscle memory, the kind of vigilance that never left men like him, men who had spent too many years watching for unseen threats. Lawson was beside him, his hands tucked in the pockets of his worn leather jacket, his gaze flicking between the empty lot and the distant hum of traffic. Then, finally, a black sedan pulled up, headlights off, rolling to a slow stop at the curb. For a few seconds, the car sat idle. Then the driver's side door creaked open, and Detective Marcus Hayes stepped out. The man moved like someone who knew he was being watched, like someone who had spent too many years surrounded by enemies, disguised as allies. His coat was pulled tight against the wind, his eyes scanning, calculating, the dim glow of the street lights casting deep lines into his face. He had the tired, hardened look of a man who had seen too much and carried every bit of it with him. For a long moment, neither side spoke. Then Hayes exhaled, shaking his head slightly. I must be out of my mind. Lawson smirked. Took you long enough to figure that out. Hayes shot him a look, then turned to Darius, his expression unreadable. You realize how this ends for you if we don't get it right? Darius held his gaze, unflinching. I know how it ends if we don't. That was the truth. There was no running, no hiding, no escape that didn't end with a bullet in his back or a story fabricated to turn him into a ghost the world forgot. The only way out was straight through, and Hayes knew it too. The detective sighed, rubbing his hand over his jaw. All right, let's talk. They moved to the sedan, where Hayes pulled out a file from the back seat, flipping it open to reveal a collection of reports. Photos, names, incidents buried under layers of false paperwork and missing evidence. This is everything I've got, Hayes said. It's not enough to bring them down. Not on its own. But it's enough to prove a pattern. Complaints that went nowhere. Reports that got lost. Witness statements that got retracted. One after the other. They've been doing this for years. His jaw clenched. And the department let it happen. Lawson leaned in, scanning the documents. The names weren't just victims. They were people who had been steamrolled. Men who had tried to fight back only to be buried by the system. Darius exhaled through his nose, his fingers curling against the edge of the car door. "We need more," Hayes nodded. "We need them on tape. Doing it in real time. No way to twist it. No way to cover it up." His voice was tight, edged with something raw. "We need them dirty. Caught red-handed. No way out." Lawson let out a slow whistle, shaking his head. "That's a dangerous setup. You really think we can pull that off before they realize we're playing them?" Darius glanced up, his expression unreadable, his mind already running through the angles. "We don't set it up." A pause. "We let them come to us." Both men looked at him. Hayes frowned. "What do you mean?" Darius's jaw tightened slightly. "They're looking for me. They're desperate. They want me gone, not in cuffs. They'll keep hunting me until they finish what they started." His voice was steady, certain. "So we make sure when they find me, it's where we want them. And this time, they won't have the excuse of self-defense." Hayes let out a slow breath. "You're talking about baiting them." Lawson ran a hand down his face, shaking his head. "That's risky as it gets." Darius's expression didn't change. "They already shot at me in the street. They already tried to take me down in my own home. This doesn't stop until we put them in a situation they can't talk their way out of." Hayes was quiet for a moment. Then he let out a sharp exhale. "We're gonna need witnesses." Lawson nodded, his mind already racing ahead. "We can set that up. I know people. Good people who won't just roll over when the department tries to pressure them. We'll need cameras, audio, undeniable evidence that puts these guys away for good." Hayes crossed his arms, his face dark with something that had been brewing in him for years. "They're going to come in guns blazing. We're talking execution style. Make it look like justified force kind of situation." Darius's gaze didn't waver. "I know. You sure about this?" Hayes asked. And it wasn't a challenge. It was something else. Something deeper. Darius nodded once. "I've been fighting my whole life. Not about to stop now." A long silence stretched between them. Then Hayes sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "All right, we set the stage. We give them the rope, and we watch them hang themselves." Lawson cracked a grin, though there was no humor in it. "I almost feel bad for them." Darius didn't smile. "Don't, because when the time came, there wouldn't be any mercy." The weight of the decision settled over them like a silent storm, thick in the air, pressing against their lungs, but none of them hesitated. There was no turning back now. The plan was set, and the only way out was through. Detective Marcus Hayes stood with his hands on his hips, his gaze fixed on the city beyond the alleyway, where streetlights flickered against the cold asphalt, where patrol cars roamed in search of the man standing beside him. He had spent years walking the line between what was right and what was necessary, and now he had finally stepped over it. There was no badge that could protect him from this if it went wrong, no department willing to shield him if they found out what he was doing. But it didn't matter anymore. "This is how it's gonna work," Hayes said, turning back to face Darius and Lawson. "I'll let the right people hear the wrong thing. A whisper in the department about where you might be. Something vague enough that it won't seem like a setup, but just clear enough to get their attention. Briggs and Calloway are already desperate, already paranoid. They won't wait for orders. They'll take the bait the moment they hear it." Darius nodded once, his expression unreadable. He was already shifting into the mindset he had lived in for years. The space between survival and action, between waiting and striking. He had spent his life stepping into the fire, and this time was no different. Lawson exhaled, running a hand down his face. "How much time we talking?" "Hours, maybe less," Hayes said. "They've been waiting for a lead, listening to radio chatter, looking for an excuse. We give them one." He turned toward Darius, his voice dropping slightly. "You sure about this? The moment they find you, they're coming in full force. They won't talk. They won't hesitate. They'll want this done before the sun comes up." Darius's gaze was steady, his body already settling into something controlled, something cold. He had fought wars, had been trained to endure worse than anything these two men could bring. He wasn't afraid of them. "I'm ready," he said simply. Hayes studied him for a moment longer, then nodded. "All right." He reached into his coat, pulling out a phone and passing it to Lawson. "This stays with you. It's wired directly to a backup server. Whatever happens, you record it. If they try to spin this, if they try to make it go away, we put the real story out before they can bury it. Lawson took the phone, gripping it tightly before sliding it into his pocket. Darius inhaled slowly, rolling his shoulders, feeling the dull ache of his injured arm, but pushing it aside. Pain was a distraction. His focus needed to be absolute. "Where's the location?" he asked. Hayes hesitated for half a second, then sighed. "It has to be somewhere in public. Somewhere with witnesses. Somewhere they think you are alone, but people are watching." Darius understood immediately. They would come in expecting an easy target, expecting him to be alone, expecting to finish what they started. Lawson shook his head, rubbing his jaw. "They've probably done this before. Took out their competition. Set up situations where it's just their word against a dead man's." Hayes didn't argue. "They've done a lot. But this time, they'll be the ones walking into a trap." Darius exhaled slowly, looking toward the dark horizon. Every step of this was dangerous. Every moment leading up to it could go wrong in 100 different ways. But there was no other choice. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about the people they had already destroyed, the ones they thought no one would fight for. "Let's get to work," Darius said. Hayes nodded. "I'll plant the lead. You go get ready." The night stretched over the city like a weighted blanket, the quiet streets laced with unseen danger, tension coiling in the air like a storm waiting to break. Darius sat in the back of David Evans's garage, rolling his injured shoulder, flexing his fingers as he tested the strength in his arm. The wound still burned, still pulled against his skin when he moved too fast, but he had fought through worse. He would fight through this. David stood across from him, arms crossed, eyes narrowed. He had already put the pieces together, already figured out what Darius was about to do, and he didn't like it. "This is suicide," David said finally, his voice low, controlled, but carrying the weight of something deeper. Darius met his gaze. "It's necessary." David exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "You're walking into this with a bullet wound, 2 corrupt cops trying to take you out, and a plan that requires them to mess up in front of people who can actually hold them accountable. You really think it's going to go that clean?" "No," Darius admitted. "But it doesn't have to be clean. It just has to work." David stepped back, shaking his head again. "You know, you could have just stayed gone. Found a way out of this." Darius exhaled slowly. "I don't run." David's expression darkened. "You better not lose then." Across town, Hayes walked into the station, moving like a man with no extra weight on his shoulders, keeping his expression unreadable, his stance casual. He stopped at the break room door, where 3 officers sat, one of them scrolling through his phone, another flipping through paperwork. A radio hummed low in the background. Hayes leaned against the frame. "You hear about Carter?" One of them glanced up, eyebrows raised. "What about him?" Hayes made a face, shaking his head slightly. "They're saying he's been spotted near the south side of the city in Crestwood, probably trying to gather supplies at a friend's house to go on the run. But knowing Briggs and Calloway, I doubt they're gonna let it get that far." He shrugged, like it wasn't his problem, then stepped away, leaving the words lingering in the air behind him. He didn't have to look back to know they were already making the call. The trap was set, and now all that was left was to wait. The police station carried a quiet hum in the late hours, the kind of stillness that came not from peace, but from anticipation, from a city holding its breath between waves of chaos. A few officers lingered in the halls, some finishing reports, others mindlessly scrolling through their phones. The sound of a distant radio crackled softly behind a closed door, dispatch murmuring updates about patrols, routine stops, minor disturbances. Inside a small back office, Briggs and Calloway sat hunched over a desk, their expressions tight, their patience worn thin. The department had been buzzing with talk of Darius Carter since the moment he escaped. The manhunt had expanded, officers sweeping neighborhoods, patrol cars cruising the streets, and yet nothing. No sign of him. No trail to follow. He had disappeared. Briggs drummed his fingers against the desk, the irritation settling deep in his chest, heavier with each passing hour. "He's making us look bad," he muttered, shaking his head. "A whole department looking for one man, and we can't find him?" His fingers curled into a fist, tapping against the wood. "We should have finished this at his house." Calloway leaned back in his chair, his arms crossed, his expression unreadable. "We didn't expect him to put up that kind of fight," he said simply. "Thought he'd go down like the others. Thought he'd know better." Briggs exhaled sharply through his nose, his jaw tightening. That was the problem. Carter wasn't like the others. He hadn't folded under pressure, hadn't panicked, hadn't made the mistakes they had counted on. He had fought back, and that couldn't be allowed. There was a knock at the office door, and a uniformed officer stuck his head in. Word just came in. Carter might have been spotted. Both men straightened, their attention snapping to the officer immediately. "Where?" Briggs asked, his voice sharp. "Over at a buddy's place. Guy named Evans. Runs a garage on the west side." The officer glanced between them. "He's been laying low since the escape. But someone says they saw him show up there a couple hours ago." Briggs and Calloway exchanged glances, and for the first time in hours, Briggs felt the frustration ease just enough for something colder to settle in its place. They had him. Calloway smirked, shifting in his chair. "Took him long enough?" Briggs nodded, exhaling slowly, letting the weight of the moment settle into his chest. "He knows we're coming," he said, his voice measured, certain. He wouldn't be anywhere near a friend unless he thought he was safe. Calloway leaned forward, resting his elbows on the desk. "So, what's the play?" Briggs tapped a finger against the wood, considering. "We keep it simple. No back and forth. No wasting time. We get in, we get him, we finish it." His expression darkened. "No mistakes this time." Calloway nodded, the amusement fading from his eyes. "No mistakes." Briggs stood, adjusting his holster, rolling his shoulders slightly as the tension in his body shifted into something more familiar. The weight of control, the certainty that they were about to end this on their terms. "We go in quiet," Briggs said, voice low. "No radio chatter, no backup. Just us, just him." Calloway's smirk returned. "And his buddy?" Briggs glanced toward the clock on the wall, watching the seconds tick by, feeling the weight of the moment settle in his chest. Not like fear, not like doubt, like certainty. "If Evans is smart, he won't be a problem," Briggs said simply. "If he is?" He picked up his badge, clipped it to his belt, adjusted his coat. "We make sure no one's around to listen." Calloway followed him out, their footsteps steady, deliberate, the kind of confidence that came from knowing the system worked in their favor. In their minds, this wasn't just another takedown. This was a correction, a message, a reminder to every single person who might have thought they could stand against them. Because when they were done tonight, Darius Carter wouldn't be a problem anymore. The night was still. Darius stood in the dim glow of the garage's overhead light, rolling his injured shoulder, feeling the stiffness settle deeper, the dull ache pulsing beneath the bandages. The hours had passed in silence, each minute stretching longer than the last. He had been here before, in places far from home, waiting for an enemy he couldn't see, knowing the moment of impact was creeping closer with every breath. That was the thing about combat. Time always felt slowest when the fight was seconds away. Across the room, David Evans watched him carefully, arms crossed, face set in a hard line of frustration and unspoken worry. He had argued, tried to talk Darius out of this, tried to convince him that there was another way, any way that didn't end with more blood spilled. But deep down, he had known the answer before he even asked. Darius wasn't running. He never had. "Everything set?" Darius asked, voice steady, unreadable. David exhaled, shaking his head slightly before nodding. "Yeah. Lawson's got people watching from a distance. Hayes is in position. He said to keep your head down until they move." He let out a slow breath. "You sure you can handle this?" Darius flexed his fingers, rolling his shoulders once more, testing the strength in his limbs. "If I couldn't, it wouldn't change anything." David watched him for a long moment, then let out a quiet chuckle, shaking his head again. "You've always been like this, man. stubborn as ever. Darius let out the faintest smirk before glancing toward the garage door. They'll be here soon. David's face hardened. Then let's be ready. A few blocks away, the quiet neighborhood sat untouched by the weight of what was about to happen. The streetlights buzzed, flickering against the cracked pavement, the air thick with that stillness that only came when the city had slowed to a crawl, when most of its people were sleeping behind locked doors, unaware of the kind of violence that existed just beyond their walls. A black sedan rolled to a slow stop at the curb. Briggs sat in the driver's seat, one hand gripping the wheel, the other resting against the cool weight of his gun at his hip. His jaw was tight, his expression unreadable, but the flicker of something sharp, something controlled, lingered beneath the surface. Calloway sat beside him, his fingers drumming idly against his knee, his gaze locked onto the garage a few houses down, where the overhead light cast long shadows against the pavement. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then Calloway exhaled, shaking his head slightly. "Gotta admit, I thought this would take longer. Thought he'd be smarter than this." Briggs let out a quiet chuckle, low and sharp. "They always think they're smart, until they realize they're not." Calloway smirked, stretching his arms slightly. "Think he's got company in there?" Briggs considered it for a moment, then shrugged. "Probably, but it won't matter. They know better than to step in. Nobody in this neighborhood is going to play hero." Calloway glanced toward the other houses, noting the darkness behind the windows, the silence stretching across the block. Even if someone was awake, they wouldn't do anything. Not in this town. Briggs exhaled slowly, his gaze returning to the garage. He's out of options. If he thought he had a way out, he'd be long gone by now. He knows we're coming. Calloway nodded, pushing open the door, stepping out into the cool night air. "Good. That makes it easier." Briggs followed, straightening his coat, adjusting his badge, his footsteps steady, deliberate. They weren't rushing. There was no need to. This was inevitable. This was what they did. As they crossed the street, the neighborhood remained silent. The air was thick with the weight of something final. And inside the garage, Darius Carter waited. The knock came sharp, deliberate, not a request, not a courtesy, but an announcement of authority, a sound that carried weight, expectation, and the unspoken promise that refusal was not an option. Darius stood motionless near the workbench, his breathing steady, his pulse slow and controlled. The moment had arrived. David stood a few feet away, arms crossed, his face tense with quiet frustration, knowing what was about to happen, yet powerless to stop it. He glanced toward Darius, but there was nothing left to say. Everything had already been decided. The knock came again, harder this time. "Evans, open up!" Briggs's voice called from the other side, his tone calm, measured, but carrying the undercurrent of a man who had already made up his mind about how this was going to end. David didn't move. Darius exhaled slowly, rolling his shoulders, his fingers brushing against the hilt of the knife concealed at his waist, not as a first option, but as an answer to whatever came next. Briggs knocked a third time, impatience creeping into his voice. "We're not going to ask again." Darius glanced at David, then moved toward the door, each step deliberate, his body loose but coiled beneath the surface. He reached for the handle, pausing only for a fraction of a second before unlocking it and pulling it open. Briggs and Calloway stood on the other side. They carried themselves like they always had, confident, unrushed, men who never expected resistance because they had never needed to. They weren't tense, weren't cautious, because they believed this was just another cleanup job, another problem to be erased before sunrise. Briggs was the first to speak, tilting his head slightly as his eyes raked over Darius, taking him in like a predator, sizing up wounded prey. "Carter," he said, a smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Long time no see." Darius didn't answer. His gaze flicked between the two men, tracking the subtle shifts in their stance, the weight in their arms, the way Calloway's hand hovered just a little too close to his holster. David was behind him now, standing firm but silent, his presence understood but ignored. This wasn't about him. This had never been about anyone but Darius. Briggs let out a quiet chuckle, shaking his head slightly. See? I thought we might have to go hunting for you. Thought you'd be smart enough to keep running, he sighed, shrugging slightly. Guess not. Darius finally spoke, his voice low, calm, unshaken. I don't run. Briggs's smirk widened. That's right. You don't. You fight. His head tilted slightly. You fought us pretty hard back at your house, didn't you? Calloway let out a quiet laugh, shaking his head. Yeah, had to be the most trouble we've had in a long time. Darius didn't move, his posture unwavering, his expression unreadable. Briggs exhaled slowly, then took a step forward, lowering his voice just slightly. You know how this ends, right? His tone wasn't mocking, wasn't threatening. It was a man stating what he saw as inevitable. No badge, no department backing you up, no uniform to hide behind. Just you, a couple of bodies, and a story we get to tell however we want. Calloway nodded, stepping up beside him. Ain't gonna be much of a story, though. Just another guy who lost it, went off the deep end, reached for the wrong thing at the wrong time. His smirk widened. It happens. Darius didn't blink. He had known this moment was coming since the second they had forced their way into his home, since the moment he had fought back, since the instant he had heard their gunfire cutting through the streets as he ran. There was no talking them down, no changing the outcome they had already written in their minds. But that didn't mean they were the ones who were going to dictate how this ended. Briggs sighed, shaking his head again, like this was all just an inconvenience. Here's the deal, Carter. You step outside with us. Keep your hands where we can see them, and we make this easy. You resist? His gaze darkened. Then we do what we have to. A long silence settled between them. Darius could hear the distant hum of a passing car, the faint crackling of a street lamp, the soft creak of David shifting his stance behind him. But beyond all of it, he could feel the weight of the moment, the thin, razor-edge balance between what they expected to happen and what was actually about to. He took a slow breath. Then he stepped forward. Briggs's smirk widened slightly, the tension in his shoulders easing as he took it as compliance, as surrender. Calloway relaxed just a fraction, his fingers still near his holster, but no longer bracing for immediate action. Darius took a slow step forward, his eyes locked on Briggs and Calloway, reading the moment, feeling the shift in their stance, the way their bodies eased just slightly, the way they thought they had already won. They expected compliance. They expected him to give up, to let them dictate the end of this. They were wrong. His muscles coiled, breath steady, mind already 5 steps ahead. Then he moved. A sudden pivot, a sharp burst of speed. His body snapped into motion before they could process it, before their brains could catch up to what was happening. He lunged past Calloway, driving his shoulder into the man's arm as he exploded out of the garage, out into the night, out into the open, where the world could see. Briggs shouted, a curse lost beneath the sudden scrape of boots against pavement, as both officers reacted too late, their hands scrambling for their weapons as Darius tore down the driveway, across the yard, onto the street. His legs burned with the force of the sprint, his shoulder screaming in protest, the pain searing up his arm. But he didn't slow. The street stretched wide in front of him, the dark pavement glowing under flickering street lights. The neighborhood wasn't asleep anymore. Lights flickered on, curtains shifted, eyes peeked through blinds. People were watching, witnesses, just as planned. Darius reached the center of the road, then skidded to a stop. He raised his hands, fingers spread, body rigid, muscles tight, as he forced himself to stillness, breathing heavy but controlled. Then, slowly, he dropped to his knees. The moment stretched, thick with something heavy, something electric, the weight of a decision hanging in the air. Briggs and Calloway had charged after him, their footsteps pounding against the pavement, the anger in their expressions shifting, flickering between disbelief and fury as they saw him kneeling, hands raised. The whole street saw him kneeling. There were too many witnesses now, people standing on porches, heads poking out of windows, voices murmuring. Briggs hesitated for half a second. Calloway didn't. The gunshot cracked through the night like lightning splitting the sky. Darius felt the impact before he registered the sound. A hot, searing punch against his shoulder that sent him jerking back, his body twisting slightly with the force of it. The crowd gasped. Briggs turned sharply, eyes flashing toward Calloway. "What are you doing?" But Calloway wasn't listening. He had already raised his gun again, his pulse hammering, the panic settling deep, the rage overtaking what little logic remained. Then came the voice. That's enough. A single command. Clear. Steady. Sharp. Briggs and Calloway spun toward the sound. Their bodies tensed, but their weapons stayed down. Because they knew the voice. Detective Marcus Hayes stepped forward from the shadows of a nearby house, his presence unmistakable, his expression unreadable. There was no gun in his hands, no aggression in his stance, just an authority that cut deeper than either of them expected. For a second, no one moved. Calloway's fingers twitched against the trigger. His body was still wired to finish this, still caught in the momentum of control, still clinging to the idea that they could silence this before it spiraled. Briggs' jaw tightened, his stance shifting as his mind raced, calculating, weighing options. They could finish it. They could still end this right here. Silence Carter, before he had the chance to speak. But then the porch light of the nearest house flicked on. Then another and another. Curtains were drawn back. Doors creaked open. Voices murmured in the night air. Shadows shifted behind windows. People stepping out, watching, taking in the scene before them. And suddenly, it wasn't just three men standing in the street anymore. It was an audience. Briggs's gaze flickered from Hayes to the growing number of figures standing in doorways, on sidewalks, some of them holding phones, others whispering. Calloway let out a slow breath, his aim still locked on Darius, his body rigid with the kind of tension that only came when a man knew he was moments away from either victory or disaster. His lips parted slightly, something sharp, something threatening about to leave his mouth. Then he saw them. The cameras, phone screens glowing in the dark, people recording, too many eyes, too many people seeing exactly what was happening. Briggs clenched his jaw, his hands flexing as he exhaled sharply, the reality sinking in. They had lost control. The entire street had seen Calloway fire. The entire street had seen Darius kneeling, unarmed. There was no twisting this, no erasing it, no walking away from it. Calloway's nostrils flared, his grip tightening like he wanted to argue, to push forward, to end this anyway. But Briggs didn't move. His eyes met Hayes's. For a long, tense moment, they just stared at each other. Then, slowly, Briggs turned toward Calloway and shook his head. Calloway's teeth clenched, but he didn't argue. He just took a step back, lowering his weapon, his hands shaking slightly from the adrenaline still pumping through his veins. Then, without another word, Briggs turned and walked toward the car. Calloway hesitated, staring at Darius, staring at the people watching them, his expression caught between fury and something unreadable. Then he followed. The car doors slammed. The engine roared to life. Then, with a screech of tires against pavement, they were gone. The street remained silent for a long moment, the tension still thick, the weight of what had almost happened still hanging in the air. Then, finally, Hayes exhaled and rushed toward Darius, who was still on his knees, his left hand pressing against the gunshot wound, his breath short, sharp, but steady. "You still with me?" Hayes asked, dropping to one knee beside him, voice steady but urgent as he scanned the wound. Darius nodded once, jaw clenched. "Yeah, good." Hayes reached for his radio, clicking it on. "Detective Hayes requesting immediate medical assistance. I have an officer-involved shooting, suspect at large, injured civilian in need of aid. Send a unit now." The response crackled back almost instantly, static laced with urgency. Darius let out a slow breath, his vision swimming slightly from the blood loss, but he didn't look away from Hayes. You think they'll be back? Hayes exhaled through his nose, pressing a firm hand against the wound to slow the bleeding. Not tonight. Darius smirked faintly, though it barely lasted. That's good enough. Hayes glanced around at the gathered witnesses, the people who had seen everything, the ones who weren't turning away this time. This wasn't over. But the tides had shifted. The night stretched heavy over the city, the weight of what had just transpired settling into every crack and shadow. Darius sat on the back of an ambulance, his breathing steady, his body still running hot with adrenaline. But the sharp, radiating pain in his shoulder kept him grounded in the moment. The damage was manageable. A clean wound, no shattered bone, no internal damage. But the weight of everything that had led up to it sat deeper than the injury itself. The EMT worked quickly, pressing fresh gauze against the wound, securing the bandage with practiced efficiency, speaking in short, clipped instructions that Darius barely registered. He wasn't focused on them. He was watching the people, the neighbors, the witnesses, the ones who had stepped out of their homes when it mattered most. They weren't just staring anymore. They were talking, and not just to each other. Lawson had arrived minutes after the gunshot, his presence magnetic, his energy sharp as he moved between the bystanders, asking the right questions, getting the right voices on record, making sure the truth was cemented before the department could get a hold of the story and twist it. People who had stayed silent before were speaking now, their voices loud, their words unwavering. I saw it. He was kneeling. He had his hands up. They fired first. No warning, nothing. Just shot him. They weren't arresting him. They were going to kill him. Lawson moved through them, his phone recording, his expression unshaken, his focus locked in on every piece of testimony that would make sure this didn't disappear. And it wouldn't. Not this time. Darius let out a slow breath, his mind drifting, replaying the moment when everything had shifted. When Briggs and Calloway had realized they weren't in control anymore. He hadn't seen fear in their eyes. Men like them didn't fear consequences, but he had seen something else. Recognition. The understanding that their time was up. And right now, somewhere across the city, they were about to realize just how true that was. Briggs drove fast, one hand gripping the wheel, the other flexing against his thigh. His jaw locked so tightly it felt like his teeth might crack under the pressure. Calloway sat beside him, shoulders hunched, fingers still curled like they were waiting for a gun that was no longer in his hands. The streetlights streaked past, the car slicing through empty intersections, but neither of them spoke. They had been in bad spots before. They had covered up worse. But this wasn't something that could be smoothed over, twisted, buried beneath missing reports and erased footage. This was different. Too many people had seen. Too many voices. Too many cameras, too much light shining where there should have been shadows. Briggs exhaled sharply through his nose, his fingers tightening on the wheel. We need to get ahead of this. Calloway let out a humorless chuckle, shaking his head. How? Briggs didn't answer right away. His mind was already moving, already calculating, already flipping through the possibilities. They needed a story. They needed something that turned the focus away from them. Something that shifted the narrative before it caught momentum, before the department decided they weren't worth protecting. Because that's how it worked. They had been untouchable for years, but only because they had always kept things clean, manageable, hidden beneath layers of plausible deniability. The moment they became a liability, the moment their actions became a weight too heavy for the department to carry, the protection would disappear. And they would be left to burn. Briggs exhaled sharply, shaking his head. We say Carter had a weapon. The shot was justified. He ran, resisted, reached for something. Calloway scoffed, his grip tightening. They're not going to believe that. Not with all those people watching. Briggs shot him a sharp glance. Then we make them believe it. We move first. File the report. Get ahead of the narrative before anyone else can. Calloway didn't answer right away. His fingers drummed against his knee, his body still running on the lingering charge of adrenaline, the frustration of having had control ripped away. He hated this, hated feeling like the walls were closing in. hated knowing they had been forced to retreat. Then, finally, he nodded. Fine. Briggs took the next turn, the police station coming into view in the distance, its cold, sterile lights glowing against the dark sky. They were almost there, almost inside, almost safe. Then the sirens flared behind them. Both men stiffened. Briggs's eyes flicked to the rearview mirror, the glow of red and blue flashing like an omen, growing brighter, chasing them down. A single patrol car. Then two, then three. His grip on the wheel tightened. Calloway turned, his eyes narrowing. What the? Then the police radio crackled to life. Unit 207. Stand down immediately. Pull over. Briggs didn't slow. Calloway sat straighter. They can't be serious. But the sirens didn't fade. The lights didn't disappear. Then came the second command. Unit 207. This is your final warning. Pull over. Now. Briggs's stomach tightened. His fingers flexed against the wheel. Everything inside him screamed to keep driving, to get to the station, to force the department to back them the way they always had. But something in his gut knew. The station wouldn't protect them. Not anymore. His jaw clenched. Then, finally, he let out a slow breath and pulled the car to the side of the road. Calloway sat completely still, his hands pressing against his knees, his breath coming short and sharp, his anger burning behind his eyes. The first squad car rolled to a stop behind them. Then another. Doors opened. Footsteps approached. Then, finally, the voice that sealed their fate. Briggs. Calloway. Detective Marcus Hayes stood outside the driver's side window, his badge shining beneath the streetlight, his expression unreadable. Step out of the vehicle. A long pause. Briggs exhaled through his nose, then glanced at Calloway. For the first time, there was no way out. Hours later, He Station was cold, sterile, and drowned in the harsh glow of fluorescent lighting. The walls were the color of old paper, faded and lifeless, holding the weight of too many voices, too many stories that had ended in silence. Darius had been in worse places, seen worse sights, but there was something about this building, about the way justice had been warped and reshaped within these walls, that made his skin crawl. He shouldn't have been here, but the system had never been designed to work in his favor. Technically, he was still under investigation. Hayes had argued with the officers on scene, had pushed for Darius to be taken to the hospital first, but the department had pushed back harder. The official excuse was that he had been involved in a violent incident that needed to be processed before he could be released. The real reason was simpler. They wanted to remind him that even now, even after exposing Briggs and Calloway, he wasn't free yet. This was a delay, a way to drag their feet, a way to force him through the process, to put him in cuffs, even if they knew he didn't belong in them. So, instead of resting in a hospital bed, instead of getting stitches in a proper medical facility, he was here, being led through the cold hallways of a building that had never been meant to protect him. Hayes walked beside him, his badge displayed openly, his expression unreadable. He had done everything he could to keep the department from making this worse, but even he couldn't stop them from taking Darius in. The officers at the booking desk barely looked at him as they took his fingerprints, entered his information, and muttered clipped procedural words that meant nothing. He had no charges yet, none that would stick, but the system was designed to hold men like him before it ever decided if they were guilty. The goal wasn't always conviction. Sometimes the punishment was just the process itself. Hayes didn't say much, but Darius could feel the tension in his stance, the way his jaw locked every time another officer walked by, the way he stood just a little too close, like he was preparing for something to go wrong at any second. Then came the sound of boots against tile, the sharp, irritated voices cutting through the hum of the station. Briggs and Calloway. Their faces were tight with frustration, the realization of their own downfall settling into their bones like an illness they couldn't shake. Their uniforms were gone, stripped away the moment the department realized there was no sweeping this under the rug. They wore the same jumpsuits as any other man waiting to be processed, their wrists cuffed, their movements stiff with resentment. They had spent years locking men in these cells. Now, they were the ones being led down the hallway, past the officers who had once followed their orders. Calloway was the first to break the silence, his voice sharp, cutting through the air with forced confidence. "This is ridiculous," he snapped, jerking against the grip of the officer escorting him. "We were doing our jobs. That guy is the criminal, not us." No one responded. Briggs was quieter, his expression unreadable, but his jaw was tight, his breathing controlled, his mind no doubt running through the list of connections he thought could save him. Except there was no saving them now. Darius felt their eyes lock onto him as they were marched past, the weight of their hatred settling onto his shoulders like something tangible. They had lost. But men like them never saw themselves as defeated. They just saw obstacles. Hayes let out a slow breath beside him, shaking his head slightly. "This is what happens when you think you're untouchable." Briggs scoffed, but didn't look at him. They reached the holding cells. The officer leading Darius came to a stop, motioning for him to step inside one of the open units. The door stood wide, waiting. Then the next cell opened, and Briggs and Calloway were ushered inside. Darius exhaled through his nose, shaking his head slightly as realization settled in. Of course, the department had never been built to protect him. Even now, after everything, they were still playing their games. They wanted him here. They wanted him sitting in a cell beside the same men who had shot him, the same men who had tried to erase him from existence. They wanted to remind him that no matter what had happened out there, in here, he was still just another black man waiting for someone else to decide his fate. He stepped inside the cell without protest, sitting on the bench with careful ease, his shoulders stiff but controlled. The heavy clang of the metal door slamming shut echoed down the hall. But Darius barely reacted. He had heard worse. A slow, cold silence stretched between the three of them. Briggs leaned against the far wall of his cell, his arms crossed, his expression unreadable. Calloway, on the other hand, was still restless, still burning with frustration, his foot tapping against the tile as his eyes darted toward Darius. Darius didn't look at them, didn't acknowledge them. He had already won. Now, it was just a matter of waiting for the world to catch up. The holding cell was silent, the air thick with unspoken tension. The weight of it pressed into the corners, settling between the three men like an invisible force waiting to be acknowledged. The cold metal bench beneath Darius barely registered as he sat still, his breathing even, his injured shoulder throbbing beneath the fresh bandages. He knew this wouldn't last, knew this was just the final inconvenience before they let him walk free. Briggs and Calloway, on the other hand, had no such certainty. They had spent their entire careers controlling what happened in places like this, deciding who went free and who didn't, dictating the rules in their favor. Now, they were sitting on the other side of the bars, stripped of the authority they had wielded like a weapon for years, and it was eating them alive. Calloway was the first to break, his frustration simmering just beneath the surface. He hadn't stopped moving since the cell door shut, pacing the short distance between the wall and the bars, his breath heavy, his hands clenched into fists. Every so often, his gaze flicked toward Darius, sharp with resentment, but Darius never acknowledged it. He refused to give them the satisfaction of knowing their anger had any weight. Briggs, by contrast, sat still, leaning against the back wall, arms crossed over his chest, his face unreadable. But Darius could see it. The tension in his shoulders, the way his jaw locked every time Calloway muttered under his breath, the quiet realization sinking in deeper with every passing second. They had lost, not just tonight, not just this fight. They had lost everything. It wasn't official yet, but it would be soon. Their badges were already gone, stripped the second they had stepped into the precinct in cuffs. The case against them was already growing. The witnesses too many. The evidence too clear. It wasn't a matter of if they were going down. It was a matter of how long they could delay the inevitable. Calloway let out a sharp exhale, finally stopping his pacing as he turned to face Darius directly, his voice laced with resentment. This was a setup. Darius didn't respond immediately. He didn't need to. Calloway's eyes narrowed. "We were set up." His voice was harder now, like he was only just piecing together what should have been obvious. He let out a dry laugh, shaking his head as if the realization had just settled in. "You planned this. You wanted us to come after you." Briggs exhaled through his nose, his expression darkening slightly. He had already figured it out, but he hadn't wanted to say it aloud. Darius leaned back slightly, letting the weight of Calloway's words hang between them before speaking, his voice calm, measured. "You came after me on your own. No one forced you." Briggs scoffed, shaking his head. "No, but you knew we would." His voice was quiet, but there was an edge to it, a bitterness that came from understanding just how thoroughly he had been outplayed. He exhaled sharply, glancing away for a second before looking back at Darius. "We were played." Calloway's expression twisted, his frustration boiling over. "You don't seriously believe that?" he snapped, turning to Briggs. "We're the ones in cuffs. He ran. He resisted. He got us right where he wanted us." Briggs muttered. His voice wasn't angry. It was resigned. Darius met his gaze, unreadable. Briggs leaned forward slightly, resting his elbows on his knees, his expression shifting just enough for Darius to see something else, something that almost resembled curiosity. "So when did you know?" Darius exhaled slowly, stretching his fingers slightly, feeling the stiffness in his knuckles from the fight earlier. "The moment you kicked in my door." Briggs smirked faintly, though there was no humor in it. "Should have killed you when we had the chance." Calloway scoffed, shaking his head, muttering something under his breath before leaning against the opposite wall, his arms crossed, his jaw tight. "This is ridiculous," he muttered, voice filled with barely contained bitterness. "They'll cut you loose because of politics, not because you're innocent." Darius exhaled slowly, letting his gaze settle on them for the first time since they had been locked in together. "You don't get it, do you?" His voice was calm, but there was something deeper beneath it, something final. "This was never about me being innocent. This was about you being guilty." Calloway tensed, his fingers twitching against his arms, his body still coiled, still unwilling to accept reality. He wasn't used to losing. Neither of them were. Briggs let out a slow breath, shaking his head slightly. He wasn't stupid. He knew how this was going to end. He had spent years bending the rules, twisting reality to fit whatever story suited him best. But now, the weight of truth had come crashing down. And for once, there was no one left to cover for him. Before any of them could say anything else, the sound of a door opening down the hall cut through the conversation. Footsteps, confident, unrushed, purposeful. Then a familiar voice. "Time's up." The officer escorting Darius stepped forward, unlocking the cell door with a sharp metallic click. Behind him, a woman in a crisp dark suit stood, her presence commanding without a single wasted movement. Alex Carter, one of the most respected civil rights attorneys in the city, and Darius's cousin. Her gaze barely flicked toward Briggs and Calloway before settling on Darius. "Let's go." Darius stood without hesitation, stepping out of the cell with controlled ease, his movements steady despite the wound in his shoulder. Calloway scoffed again, shaking his head, his voice sharp. "This isn't over." Darius paused, just for a second, then turned slightly, looking at them one last time. "No," he said. "It's not." Then he walked away, leaving them behind. The heavy clang of the cell door locking echoed behind him. And for the first time, they were the ones who couldn't leave. The ride from the station was quiet, the hum of the city stretching beyond the tinted windows, headlights cutting through the dim glow of street lamps. Darius sat in the back of the sleek black car, his shoulder aching beneath the bandages, his mind processing the weight of everything that had happened in the last 24 hours. The fight, the chase, the gunshot, the moment everything changed. Across from him, Alex Carter sat with her arms crossed, her sharp, calculated presence filling the space. She had always been the kind of person who operated 3 steps ahead of the world around her, dissecting every possibility before anyone else even realized there was a game to be played. Tonight had been no different. She had walked into the station with the confidence of someone who already knew the outcome, and she had been right. "I assume you know why you're out," she said finally, her voice smooth, but carrying a hard edge. Darius let out a slow breath, adjusting the bandage beneath his shirt. "Because they didn't have a reason to keep me." She gave a slow nod, tapping her fingers against the leather seat beside her. "More than that, they knew the longer they kept you, the worse this was going to get." He turned slightly, meeting her gaze. She wasn't just talking about legalities. She was talking about pressure, about the kind of weight that couldn't be ignored. "The second those officers fired on you, the second those witnesses stepped outside, the narrative changed," she continued. "The department wanted to spin this, but they couldn't. Too many eyes were watching. Too many people saw exactly what happened." Darius exhaled through his nose. He had felt it in the air that night. The shift, the way the neighborhood had woken up, the way silence had turned into voices, the way fear had been replaced with something sharper, something unmovable. "The witnesses?" he asked. Alex nodded. "Plenty, and not just bystanders. People with cameras, people who gave official statements, people who were tired of pretending this wasn't happening." She leaned forward slightly, her voice lowering. "You weren't the first person Briggs and Calloway pulled this on, but you were the first they couldn't silence." Darius tilted his head slightly, his jaw tightening. He had suspected as much. Men like Briggs and Calloway didn't start at murder. They worked their way up. Alex pulled a folder from her bag, flipping it open and skimming the top page before speaking again. "Internal affairs moved faster than I expected. With the footage, the testimonies, and the paper trail Lawson helped dig up, they had enough to push this into a full investigation. The department couldn't ignore it. The chief had no choice but to make a statement." Darius let out a slow breath, letting that settle. He wasn't naive. He knew police departments didn't suddenly turn against their own. This wasn't about justice. This was about damage control. The chief cut them loose, didn't he? Alex gave a small smirk. "Suspended. Pending investigation. But we both know what that means. The department isn't protecting them anymore. They're out." Darius nodded slowly. It was the beginning of the end for them. Briggs and Calloway weren't just two bad cops. No, they were symptoms of something much larger, much deeper, something that had existed long before them and would exist long after they were gone. But for once, the system had cracked. And now, they were the ones left to drown. "What about me?" he asked, shifting his gaze toward her. "They let me out, but are they going to try to charge me with something later?" Alex's expression didn't change. "No." She let that hang in the air for a moment before continuing. "The charges they wanted to file? Resisting arrest, assaulting an officer. Those only work when the officers in question are credible." She tilted her head slightly. "Briggs and Calloway aren't credible anymore. The moment the department distanced itself from them, any case against you fell apart. They had nothing. Keeping you in there was a move to remind you where the power was. But legally?" She shook her head. "They couldn't hold you." Darius exhaled slowly, his shoulders easing just slightly. "So, that's it," he said quietly. Alex studied him for a moment before answering. "For now." Darius gave a slow nod, glancing out the window as the car turned down a familiar street, the streetlights casting long shadows against the pavement. The battle was over, but the war wasn't. He wasn't naive enough to believe that one victory meant everything was fixed. The system didn't break overnight, and it wouldn't be rebuilt in a day. But he had made a crack, and sometimes that was enough to start something bigger. Alex sighed, leaning back in her seat. "You should rest. You're going to need your strength." Darius turned toward her, eyebrows slightly raised. "For what?" she smirked. "For what comes next." And Darius knew, without a doubt, there would be more to come. The courtroom was colder than it needed to be, the kind of sterile chill designed to keep people on edge, to remind them that this place was built to decide fates. The wood-paneled walls carried the weight of too many judgments, too many verdicts that had tilted in the wrong direction. Today, though, There was a shift in the air, an undercurrent of something different. Today, the weight was on the other side. Darius sat near the front, his presence drawing quiet glances, his name still lingering in the air like an unshakable force. For months, this case had been a storm, one that no one had been able to ignore. The trial had unfolded in brutal clarity, piece by piece, detail by detail, exposing the kind of corruption most people whispered about but rarely saw dragged into the light. Now, there were no more delays, no more loopholes to slip through. The verdict had already been reached. Today was about sentencing. Briggs and Calloway sat at the defendant's table, a far cry from the men who had once stood with confidence, flashing badges that had shielded them from consequence for years. Their tailored suits didn't change the fact that they had lost the protection they had always counted on. They looked smaller now, backs stiff, faces tight, jaws clenched as they stared straight ahead, absorbing every word as the final ruling was about to be delivered. Reporters filled the gallery, their cameras and notebooks at the ready, their presence a reminder that this wasn't just about two men. This was about a system that had allowed them to exist unchecked for years. On the other side of the room, a collection of former victims sat, some silent, others watching with unmasked intensity. People who had been steamrolled, people who had once believed that justice wasn't meant for them. Today, they were here to see what the world would do when it was forced to pay attention. Darius could feel the weight of it all settling in as the judge entered, taking her seat at the bench, her expression unreadable. The murmurs in the room quieted, the energy coiling tight, waiting for the moment everything became final. The judge's voice carried through the room, even, deliberate, each word cutting through the thick silence as she began. This court has considered the evidence presented, the testimonies given, and the undeniable pattern of behavior displayed by the defendants. These actions, carried out under the guise of authority, have resulted in irreparable harm to the community and a severe breach of public trust. She turned her gaze toward Briggs and Calloway, both of whom sat motionless, their expressions locked in place. But Darius could see it, the tightening of their jaws, the tension in their shoulders, the realization that their power had been stripped from them. Detective Matthew Briggs, found guilty on all counts. 15 years, no reaction. Officer Daniel Calloway, found guilty on all counts. 12 years. Briggs's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. Calloway exhaled sharply, his fingers curling against the table, his entire body stiff, as though he was still refusing to accept that this was real. Darius watched them, his expression unreadable. For a moment, he wondered if they had truly believed they would walk free, if they had convinced themselves that the system would protect them one last time. But there was no escaping this. Not when the entire world had already seen what they were. The judge continued, voice steady. Final. Additionally, both defendants are ordered to pay restitution for damages incurred, including but not limited to the illegal seizure of property, medical expenses, and emotional distress. A number was named. Large, substantial, enough to make an impact, to serve as a reminder that what they had done carried real weight. Enough to ensure that even once they left prison, they would never return to the life they had built on corruption. For a long moment, the room remained heavy with the weight of it all. Then the gavel struck. It was done. Briggs and Calloway were led out of the courtroom, their expressions unreadable, their futures sealed. No power, no protection, no more running. Darius exhaled slowly, his fingers flexing slightly against his knee as he stood. His movements steady, despite the dull ache still lingering in his shoulder. It was over. The drive back to his house was quiet, the weight of the last few months settling into his muscles in a way that felt different now. There was no immediate fight left to prepare for, no next step looming over his head, no enemy waiting in the dark to make a move against him. It should have felt like relief, like something final, but Darius knew better. It wasn't the end. It was just a pause, a breath between storms. When the car finally rolled to a stop in front of his house, he exhaled slowly, fingers flexing against his knee, before he reached for the door handle. The place looked the same as when he had left it. Quiet, still, untouched since the night everything had changed. But now, the air around it felt different, like the past had finally let go of its grip on these walls. He stepped out of the car, rolling his injured shoulder slightly, testing the limits of the pain, then made his way up the short path to the front door. Before he could reach for the handle, it swung open. David stood in the doorway, arms crossed, his expression unreadable. Behind him, Lawson and Hayes lingered in the living room, talking in low tones, their presence a quiet reminder that, even though the fight was over, the people who had made it happen were still here. For a moment, no one spoke. Then David shook his head, exhaling sharply. "You're out." Darius smirked faintly. "Told you I would be." David stepped aside, motioning for him to come in. "Yeah, well, I don't think that's what shocked me the most." Darius stepped inside, his gaze flickering briefly over the space, taking in the way nothing had changed, yet everything felt different. The last time he had been here, the place had been torn apart, invaded, violated. Now, it was just a house again. He turned toward the living room, where Hayes leaned against the far wall, arms crossed, watching him with an unreadable expression. Lawson, seated on the couch, let out a short laugh as he shook his head, clearly still processing everything. "You really did it," Lawson muttered. "Took a bullet just to sell it." Darius exhaled slowly, rolling his shoulder again, feeling the stiffness beneath the fresh bandages. "Didn't plan on getting shot," he admitted, voice even, but it had to look real. Lawson let out another breath, running a hand down his face. "Man, you're insane. You know that, right?" Darius smirked faintly but didn't argue. David sat down heavily in the armchair, still shaking his head as he studied him. "All those years, all that training, you knew exactly what they'd do. You knew how they'd react, how to push them right where you wanted them, and then you just let them take the shot." He scoffed, rubbing a hand over his jaw. "You're out of your mind." Darius glanced at him, something quieter in his gaze now. "It worked." David gestured toward him, frustration flickering in his expression. "Yeah, but at what cost? You could have died, man." Darius didn't respond immediately. He had thought about that too. He had known the risks, had felt the moment he made the decision settle into his bones, but in the end, it had been the only way. Hayes, still standing near the wall, finally spoke, his voice low but steady. They weren't going to stop. His gaze met Darius's, something knowing in the way he looked at him. "And you knew that?" Darius nodded. "Yeah." Silence settled over the room, thick with the weight of everything unspoken. Lawson leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "And now?" Darius exhaled through his nose, glancing toward the window, where the streetlights cast long shadows across the pavement outside. "Now, I start over." David raised an eyebrow. "With what?" Darius smirked slightly. "With the money they owe me?" Lawson chuckled. "Right. Forgot about that. Those guys are paying out. What? 7 figures?" Darius nodded once. It had been part of the settlement, part of the reckoning that had come down on Briggs and Calloway after everything was laid bare. Between the lawsuit, the city's damage control, and the judge's ruling, he had walked away with more than just his freedom. He had walked away with enough to build something new. David exhaled, shaking his head. "And you're just gonna walk away from all of this?" Darius looked at him, something calm in his expression. "Yeah." For a long time, all he had known was the fight. First on the battlefield, then in the city streets, then in a courtroom where his future had been decided in a way he had never anticipated. But now, for the first time in years, he had the chance to decide what came next. And he wasn't going to waste it. His gaze shifted toward Hayes, who had been watching him quietly, not saying much, just taking in the moment, the way only someone who understood the weight of sacrifice could. Darius nodded at him. "You never had to get involved in this." His voice was even, but there was gratitude in it. "I know what it cost you." Hayes exhaled slowly, shaking his head slightly, but his expression was relaxed, settled. It was the right thing to do. Darius gave a slow nod. Not a lot of people in your position would have done it. Hayes smirked faintly, the ghost of something resembling amusement crossing his face. Yeah, well, turns out some people noticed. David let out a sharp laugh, shaking his head. Oh, yeah. Forgot to mention that part. Darius raised an eyebrow. What part? Lawson grinned, pulling his phone from his pocket and tapping the screen before holding it up. The screen showed a news article, bold headline across the top. Detective Marcus Hayes awarded Medal of Valor for exposing corruption within the department. Darius blinked, then let out a quiet chuckle. They gave you a medal? Hayes rolled his eyes, shaking his head. Yeah. City loves a redemption story, David smirked. Guess they had to make it look like they actually reward people for doing the right thing. Hayes exhaled, folding his arms. I'll take it if it means they can't sweep this under the rug. Darius nodded, his expression unreadable, then extended a hand. Hayes eyed it for a second, then smirked and shook it. Thanks, Darius said simply. Hayes just nodded. Darius turned toward Lawson and David next, his gaze settling on them for a moment, before he exhaled. All of you, I don't say it much, but I appreciate it, David smirked. Yeah, just remember that when you're sitting on all that money. Lawson chuckled. You buying dinner, right? Darius exhaled, shaking his head with a smirk as he turned toward the kitchen. Fine, but I'm picking the place, David grinned. With your payout, we're eating somewhere nice. Darius let out a slow breath, rolling his shoulders slightly as he leaned against the counter, his home finally feeling like his again. For the first time in a long time, he wasn't looking over his shoulder, wasn't waiting for the next battle. Now, he was just a man rebuilding his life, and that was more than enough. I hope you enjoyed that story. Please share it with your friends and subscribe so that you do not miss out on the next one. In the meantime, I have handpicked 2 stories for you that I think you will enjoy. Have a great day.